So Canada just walked away from the United States with $240 billion in new trade deals, and the White House didn't see it coming. In the span of 6 months, Prime Minister Mark Carney has signed 12 new economic and security agreements with nations across 4 continents. He has opened direct trade channels with China that slashed Canadian canola tariffs from 85% to 15%. He has launched a $5 billion trade diversification corridors fund designed to physically reroute Canadian exports away from American ports and toward the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic. He is committed to increasing Canada's defense budget to 5% of GDP, with 70% of that military spending directed exclusively to domestic manufacturers, cutting the United States out of contracts that American defense firms have held for generations. And he has done all of this while the American administration was focused on posting threats on social media, calling Canada a state, and referring to its democratically elected prime minister as a governor. Warren Buffett, speaking to associates after reviewing the full scope of Canada's diversification strategy, delivered a verdict that sources describe as the most damning economic assessment he has offered in years. "In 95 years on this earth," Buffett said, "I have never watched a country hand its closest ally a more compelling reason to leave. And I have never watched that ally execute a departure with more precision." And when you hear what actually happened behind the scenes, the strategic calculations that Ottawa made, the specific moments where Washington's own actions accelerated the very outcome it was trying to prevent, and the irreversible infrastructure now being built to replace the American trade relationship permanently, you'll understand why senior economists on both sides of the border are calling this the most consequential economic realignment between 2 Western nations since the end of the Second World War. Hit subscribe because this is unfolding in real time, and every week the structure shifts further in a direction that cannot be reversed. Let me walk you through how we got here, because this did not happen overnight. It was the product of a series of escalating provocations, strategic miscalculations, and one fundamental misunderstanding of who Mark Carney is and what he was prepared to do. The trade war between the United States and Canada had been grinding for over a year. What began as 25% tariffs imposed in early 2025, ostensibly over border security concerns, had metastasized into something far broader and far more personal. Steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, auto sector levies that hit Ontario manufacturing towns like a wrecking ball, with sales at tool and die shops dropping nearly 70%, dozens of workers laid off, softwood lumber duties that devastated communities from British Columbia to New Brunswick, copper tariffs, kitchen cabinet tariffs. The list kept expanding, and with each expansion, the message from Washington became less about trade policy and more about subordination. The Bank of Canada quantified the damage in a January report that should have been a wake-up call for everyone involved. Canadian GDP growth slashed from 1.7% to 1.1%. The average American tariff rate on Canadian products had risen from 0.1% to 5.8% in a single year. Cross-border industrial stocks cratering, energy companies with Canadian supply chain dependencies losing billions in combined market capitalization, auto plants in Windsor and manufacturing facilities across Ontario losing shifts, losing hours, losing workers. These were not abstract numbers. These were families. These were retirement portfolios. These were communities that had built their entire economic existence around a trade relationship they believed was permanent. Most Americans don't realize what was happening inside the Canadian government during this period. Carney, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, the only person in history to have led 2 G7 central banks, was not reacting to Trump's provocations. He was cataloging them. Every tariff escalation, every public insult, every time Trump referred to Canada as a state or called Carney a governor, it was logged, analyzed, and incorporated into what Ottawa internally called the Strategic Independence Framework, a document that multiple sources describe as the most comprehensive economic contingency plan ever developed by a Canadian government. The framework had been in development since before Carney took office, but it accelerated dramatically after a specific moment that Canadian officials describe as the turning point. In October 2025, Trump hosted Carney at the White House. The meeting appeared cordial. The 2 leaders sat in the Oval Office. Cameras captured the standard diplomatic choreography, handshakes, measured public statements, the practiced performance of alliance. Trump told his top officials to work out a deal with Canada on steel, aluminum, and energy. For 3 weeks, Canadian and American trade teams worked toward an agreement. Proposals were exchanged, progress was reported, both governments signaled cautious optimism through official channels, and then Trump abruptly canceled the talks. The reason, according to sources familiar with the decision, was a television advertisement. The Ontario government had aired an ad during American programming featuring a clip of Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, delivering an anti-tariff speech. Trump saw the ad. He was furious. He killed the negotiations. 3 weeks of work by dozens of officials on both sides, proposals that could have resolved billions of dollars in trade disputes, agreements that could have stabilized markets and protected workers in Michigan and Ontario simultaneously, all of it discarded because of a 30-second television commercial that bruised one person's ego. For the Canadian government, that was the moment. Not because the ad was important, not because the cancellation was surprising, but because of what the cancellation revealed about the fundamental nature of the relationship. A year of tariffs, months of preparation, weeks of good faith negotiation, billions of dollars in economic damage to workers and families on both sides of the border, and it was all discarded because of a television commercial. The Canadian delegation concluded what trade analysts had been warning for months. There was no deal to be made. Not because the economics didn't work, they did. Not because the proposals weren't serious, they were. But because the American side was not operating on economics, they were operating on psychology. And you cannot build a stable trade relationship with a partner whose commitments evaporate based on what they see on television on any given night. That conclusion triggered the activation of Phase 2 of the Strategic Independence Framework. The diversification was no longer theoretical, it was operational. And the $240 billion in new trade architecture that followed was not improvised. It was the execution of a plan that had been ready and waiting for the moment Ottawa determined that the American relationship could no longer serve as the foundation of Canadian economic security. That moment arrived in October 2025. Everything since has been the consequence. And what happened next was executed with a discipline and strategic precision that caught Washington completely off guard. The scene that officials on both sides describe as the defining image of Canada's economic pivot took place not in Ottawa and not in Washington, but in Beijing in January 2026. The room was a formal reception hall in the Great Hall of the People, high ceilings, red carpets, the kind of deliberate architectural grandeur designed to communicate that what happens in this space carries the weight of a civilization that has been making trade agreements for 5,000 years. Canadian and Chinese flags positioned side by side, a long conference table with documents arranged at precise intervals, translation equipment at every seat, water glasses filled and waiting, the physical staging of a new economic relationship being born. Mark Carney sat across from Chinese officials with a delegation that sources describe as the most senior Canadian trade team ever sent to Asia. Senior trade negotiators who had spent their careers managing the American relationship were now sitting in Beijing building its replacement. They had spent weeks preparing the specific terms. The agricultural concessions alone ran to dozens of pages. The electric vehicle framework, allowing 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market annually at a tariff rate of 6.1%, had been modeled against every possible American retaliatory scenario. The canola deal, dropping Chinese tariffs from 85% to 15%, would unlock billions in annual revenue for Canadian farmers who had watched their most valuable export market shrink under the weight of diplomatic disputes they had no part in creating. What sources describe as a meeting that lasted over 3 hours, conducted with the structured precision of two parties who had done their preparatory work and understood exactly what they were exchanging. There were no theatrics, no raised voices, no interruptions, no one checked their phone, no one leaned back in their chair with deliberate disengagement. The Chinese side presented their terms methodically, section by section, with supporting data and implementation timelines. The Canadian side responded with counter-proposals that had been anticipated and modeled. When adjustments were needed, both delegations consulted their notes, conferred with advisors in hushed tones, and returned to the table with revised language. The physical contrast to the way Canada's most recent high-level meetings with the United States had been conducted was, according to one Canadian official, not lost on anyone in that room. At approximately the 90-minute mark, according to officials present, there was a moment that several Canadian delegates later described to colleagues as the most professionally significant experience of their careers. The Chinese lead negotiator paused, set down a document he had been reviewing, looked directly across the table at Carney, and said through a translator, "We have been waiting for Canada to arrive at this table for a very long time." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but sources say it carried an enormous weight, because what the Chinese negotiator was communicating, and what every person in that room understood, was not simply that China wanted Canadian canola or Canadian minerals or Canadian agricultural products. It was that China had been watching the deterioration of the U.S.-Canada relationship with strategic patience, knowing that eventually the pressure would create exactly this opportunity. And now that opportunity was sitting across the table, represented by a former central banker who understood leverage, understood timing, and understood that in negotiation, the party willing to walk away from the old deal always gets the best terms on the new one. Carney responded with 4 words that sources on the Canadian side say defined the entire trip. Let's build something durable. The documents were signed over the following 2 days. Agricultural frameworks, electric vehicle import terms, critical mineral export agreements, tourism facilitation including visa-free travel for Canadian citizens in China, tariff reductions on Canadian lobster, crab, and peas, protections for Canadian canola meal exports through the end of 2026 and beyond. Each agreement had been designed with a specific characteristic that American trade analysts would later identify as the most strategically devastating element of the entire package. Every single deal was structured to become more valuable over time. Escalation clauses, volume increases tied to annual reviews, preferential terms that deepen as trade volumes grow. The architecture was not designed for a single transaction, it was designed for a permanent reorientation, and permanent is the word that should keep Washington strategists awake at night. 1 week later, Carney stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos and delivered a speech that diplomats across 5 continents are still analyzing. "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition," he said. He called on the world's middle powers to deepen cooperation in the face of coercion. He stated publicly what every Western leader had been thinking privately but lacked the political courage to say aloud. The rules-based international order was partially false. The strongest had always exempted themselves when convenient. Trade rules had been enforced asymmetrically, and the era of simply accepting that asymmetry was over. But the implications of that speech go far beyond rhetoric, because what Carney did in Davos was not just criticize the American-led order, he announced its replacement. And the $240 billion in trade architecture he was building was the proof of concept. The aftermath unfolded with a velocity that stunned even Canadian officials who had anticipated a strong international response. Trump's reaction came within hours of the China deal's announcement. A Truth Social post threatening 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Ottawa proceeded with what he called making Canada a drop-off port for China. He referred to Carney as governor rather than prime minister. He withdrew Carney's invitation to join his so-called Board of Peace. The rhetoric escalated with each post, each one more aggressive, each one more personal, each one providing more political ammunition for a Canadian government that was using every American provocation as evidence for why diversification was necessary. And here is the devastating irony that sits at the center of this entire story. Every threat Trump made in response to Canada's diversification strategy accelerated the diversification strategy. The 100% tariff threat didn't bring Canada back to the table. It convinced every remaining skeptic in Ottawa that the table itself was no longer safe. The insults didn't weaken Carney politically, they strengthened him. His approval ratings climbed with every American provocation because Canadian voters could see with their own eyes what their prime minister had concluded privately. The relationship was broken. The question was no longer whether to diversify, it was how fast. While Trump was posting threats on social media, Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc was already on planes, not to Washington, to Brussels, then to Tokyo, then to New Delhi, then to Canberra. In the weeks and months following the China deal, Canada executed what trade analysts are calling the most aggressive diversification sprint in the history of any G7 nation. 12 new economic and security agreements signed in 6 months. A deepened partnership with the European Union under CETA, with bilateral merchandise trade already at $134 billion, 77% above pre-agreement levels. Formal negotiations launched with India for a comprehensive economic partnership agreement targeting $70 billion in bilateral trade by 2030, a trilateral technology partnership with India and Australia on critical and emerging technologies, expanded trade frameworks with Japan, already Canada's largest Asian trade partner at $36 billion annually, a new defense and security banking partnership with the United Kingdom. Market reactions told the story that diplomatic language tried to soften. Cross-border industrial stocks continued their decline. American auto companies with Canadian supply chain dependencies faced restructuring costs that analysts estimated in the billions. Energy companies that had built their entire logistics infrastructure around cross-border pipelines began quietly exploring alternative supply arrangements. Stellantis announced a $13 billion investment in American facilities while simultaneously pulling back from its Brampton, Ontario factory, a decision driven entirely by the tariff environment that American policy had created. The integrated North American auto industry, the crown jewel of continental economic cooperation, built over 6 decades of trust beginning with the 1965 Auto Pact and reinforced through NAFTA and CUSMA, was fracturing along lines that had never existed before. Business leaders who had paused their contingency planning in hope of a deal reactivated those plans with urgency. The $240 billion in new Canadian trade architecture was not just a government initiative. It was being reinforced by private sector decisions, thousands of them, each one a small permanent step away from the American market. Warren Buffett, in an extended analysis that sources describe as the longest single commentary on a trade event he has delivered in years, translated the diplomatic catastrophe into the economic language that markets and retirement portfolios understand. What Canada has done, Buffett said, is the single most intelligent piece of economic strategy I have witnessed from any Western leader in my lifetime. They looked at a partner who was becoming unreliable, and instead of begging for better terms, they quietly built an alternative. They diversified their portfolio. That is what any rational investor does when a position becomes too concentrated and too volatile. You don't argue with the volatility, you reduce your exposure. And Canada just reduced its exposure to the United States in a way that will take a generation to reverse. Buffett went further, connecting the specific policy failures to their compounding financial costs with the clinical precision of someone who has spent 6 decades watching bad decisions compound into catastrophes. The tariffs were supposed to bring Canada to heel, he said. Instead, they gave Canada the political mandate to do something no Canadian government had been able to accomplish in 50 years, which is to actually diversify away from the American market. The Canadian public supported it because the American government made the case for diversification better than any Canadian politician ever could have. Every tariff, every insult, every time someone in Washington called Canada a state, it was a campaign advertisement for exactly the policy that is now being implemented. That is the most expensive strategic miscalculation I have seen in 60 years of watching governments make economic decisions. The interest on that mistake is compounding daily, and the bill is going to be staggering. And then Buffett delivered the verdict line. In 60 years of doing business, of studying markets, of watching nations make decisions that determine the prosperity of millions of people, I have learned one principle that has never once been proven wrong. You do not punish a partner into loyalty. You do not threaten an ally into dependence. What you do when you treat a partner with contempt is you teach them to live without you. And once they learn that lesson, once they build the infrastructure and sign the agreements and redirect the supply chains, they do not come back. Not because of anger, because of mathematics. The new architecture works. And architecture once built does not unbuild itself because someone in Washington changes their tone. Think about that for a moment. The cascading consequences of Canada's pivot extend far beyond bilateral trade numbers, and this is the part that most Americans have not yet begun to comprehend. Start with the economics. The $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund announced on March 3rd is not an abstract policy statement. It is a construction program. Pipeline capacity to the Pacific Coast, Atlantic port expansion, intermodal shipping facilities designed to connect Canadian producers directly to Asian and European markets without routing through American infrastructure, Arctic shipping corridors backed by an additional $1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund. These are physical assets. Steel in the ground, concrete poured, terminals built, shipping lanes charted. They do not disappear when administrations change. They do not reverse when rhetoric softens. They do not care about elections. Every day that construction continues, the physical architecture of Canadian trade shifts further from south-north corridors toward east-west and north-south connections to the rest of the world. $240 billion in trade agreements flowing through infrastructure that literally points away from the United States. Then the defense implications. Canada has committed to spending 5% of GDP on defense, with 70% directed to domestic manufacturers. For decades, American defense firms have supplied 70 to 75% of Canadian weapons imports. That relationship is being systematically replaced. 125,000 new defense manufacturing jobs in Canada, a 50% increase in Canadian arms exports. A new Defense, Security and Resilience Bank being established in partnership with the United Kingdom. NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command that has protected North American airspace for nearly 7 decades, now operates in a context where one partner is actively reducing its military supply chain dependency on the other. Five Eyes intelligence sharing continues, but the economic foundation beneath the security relationship is being restructured in real time. The international signal has been devastating for American strategic positioning. Japan, already recalculating its own trade dependencies, watched Canada's pivot and quietly accelerated diversification discussions with Southeast Asian partners. Germany deepened its CETA engagement with Ottawa. Australia entered trilateral technology partnerships with Canada and India. South Korea instructed its diplomatic teams to study the Canadian model as a template for managing trade volatility with Washington. The United Kingdom began building joint financial institutions with Ottawa that explicitly bypass American banking infrastructure. Poland, the Philippines, nations that depend on American security guarantees, began asking the question that no American ally had previously been willing to voice publicly. If this is how America treats Canada, the most pro-American, most economically integrated, most geographically inseparable partner it has, then what would it do to us? That question is being asked in Tokyo, in Berlin, in Canberra, in Seoul, in Warsaw, in London. And every time it is asked, the answer drives another round of diversification planning, another set of contingency frameworks, another quiet conversation about reducing exposure to American volatility. The $240 billion in Canadian trade deals is not just a bilateral story. It is a signal to every ally on Earth that the cost of American friendship has become unpredictable and that alternatives exist. China, meanwhile, has gained precisely what it wanted. Not through military pressure, not through espionage, not through any of the coercive tools that American foreign policy has spent decades warning the world about. China gained access to Canadian agricultural markets, Canadian critical minerals, Canadian trade corridors, and a foothold in the economic architecture of America's closest ally, all because the United States made the relationship so painful that Canada went looking for alternatives. The precise opposite of the stated strategic objective. The policy designed to keep Canada dependent on the United States created the conditions under which Canada built an economic relationship with America's primary strategic rival. And that relationship, structured with escalation clauses and deepening terms, will grow stronger every single year regardless of what happens in Washington. There is a principle in structural engineering that applies with devastating precision to what is happening between these two countries. When you apply stress to a structure from one direction, it holds. The structure absorbs the pressure, redistributes the load, and maintains its integrity. But when you apply compounding stress from multiple directions simultaneously, tariffs from one direction, sovereignty violations from another, public humiliation from a third, the cancellation of negotiations over television advertisements from a fourth, the structure does not bend gradually. It fails catastrophically all at once in a way that cannot be repaired by removing any single source of pressure because the failure has become systemic. Each crisis eliminates options for resolving the others. The situation is not just bad from multiple angles, it is compoundingly, inescapably, structurally irreversible. That is what has happened to the U.S.-Canada economic relationship. The stress was not applied from one direction. It was applied from every direction simultaneously, over months, in public, with contempt. And the structure has not bent. It has begun to be replaced. $240 billion. That is the value of the new trade architecture that Canada has built or initiated in 6 months. 12 new agreements across 4 continents. A $5 billion infrastructure fund to physically reroute exports away from American ports. A defense restructuring that will remove American firms from contracts they have held for generations. A formal partnership with China that deepens automatically every year. A speech at Davos that told every middle power on Earth that the post-American trade order is not a theoretical concept, but a construction project with funding allocated and milestones set. Buffett called it the most intelligent economic strategy he has witnessed from any Western leader in his lifetime. He also called it the most expensive strategic miscalculation he has seen in 6 decades of watching governments make economic decisions. Both statements are true simultaneously, and that is the devastating irony at the core of this story. The brilliance of Canada's strategy and the catastrophe of America's approach are not separate events. They are the same event viewed from opposite sides of a border that used to represent the most successful economic partnership in the history of the Western world. What was built over 75 years is being disassembled with a speed and efficiency that should alarm every American who depends on cross-border trade, cross-border security, cross-border supply chains, and the fundamental assumption that the country next door would always be there. That assumption is no longer operative. The contingency plan was activated, the diversification is underway, the corridors are being built, the agreements are being signed, and every single day the economic relationship that took 75 years to build, that survived world wars and recessions and political disputes across a dozen administrations, becomes a little less central to Canada's future and a little more difficult to restore to what it was. $240 billion in new architecture, 75 years of trust being replaced, and the country doing the replacing is not acting out of anger, it is acting out of mathematics. Keep an eye on this. The infrastructure is being poured, the contracts are binding, and the window to stop what is now in motion is closing faster than anyone in Washington appears to understand.